One bias that does seem to dominate, at least American journalism, runs counter to what we're told, which is that journalists speak truth to power. I find very often journalists are lapdogs to power.
The prime example of this was Walter Duranty, who won a Pulitzer for the New York Times for his coverage of the Soviet Union back in the 20s and 30s.
When I used to teach undergraduates, I was shocked at how many of them had no idea that millions of Ukrainians in 1932 and 1933 were starved to death in a deliberately engineered famine under Stalin. To this day, people don't know about it. Walter Duranty of the New York Times was probably the primary reason that people at the time didn't really know what was going on, or at the very least, he made it seem murky, that who can really know what's really going on over there? And when we look at his sympathies, which we see from his own statements, well, his motivations seem pretty clear. I mean, he said, for example, unless untoward and unforeseen circumstances intervene, I, for one, cannot doubt the ultimate success of socialist building in the USSR. And he goes on to praise Lenin and say things that are just embarrassingly over the top about a horrifying butcher. There was a well-known journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge. He was the Manchester Guardian Moscow correspondent, and he did go to Ukraine, except he had the temerity to look around in areas where officials didn't want him looking. And he smuggled articles about the reality of the famine out of Ukraine. But the problem was, with Duranty assuring people that everything was fine, the result of Muggeridge's articles was simply to make people say, well, I guess nobody can really know what's actually going on. Meanwhile, Muggeridge referred to Duranty as, quote, the greatest liar of any journalist I have met in 50 years of journalism.
Well, that's not entirely accurate, Tom, because as you know, in 1941, after all those literally millions of people were starved to death, Duranty said, well, I was lamentably wrong about the extent and gravity of the man-made famine in Russia during the fight to collectivize the farm. But every reporter who's worth his salt tries always to tell the truth. So he covers up millions of people being killed, and then 8 years later, oops, well, I guess that's why pencils have erasers. This is why it's so important to identify an agenda when the press or when any agency of power has it. Because very often governments can become usurpacious and turn on its own citizenry. It is only the journalists, especially international journalists, who are in a position to make plain what is being done to these civilians in these countries, regardless of one's political views. Food is not a partisan issue. If their agenda is always talk about how bad things are in America and how doing things their way will make it better, many, many lives will be lost and no one will know about it until decades later. Lives that could have been saved. All right, you can make the argument, look, this is 80 years ago. It's a dark moment in the history of the time and of American journalism in general. Fine. The corporate press learns their mistakes, right? That same New York Times, who you'd expect to be sensitive to the fact that they had blood on their hands covering up the Soviet Union's genocide, still, it's current year. How are we having this conversation? Writes articles about the diversity of Russian astronauts, how women were getting more pleasure under communism, and even happy birthday, Karl Marx.
Michael, what do you expect the press to report on Russia? Where are they going to find the space for that?
We talked earlier about apologizing and learning from one's mistakes. We're seeing the apologies on page 823, but we're not seeing the amending of the behavior that caused the things that they had to apologize for to begin with. There's a perverse incentive structure here. Here's how it works. You put forward a loosely sourced or even false story. You get a lot of clicks, you get a lot of eyeballs, you get a lot of attention, you get a lot of press. More information comes out, you do your homework, story's false. Maybe you knew it all along, who knows? Then you apologize. The cost of the apology is very little. So there's a huge incentive to do this whole cycle again. So it's basically like an apology tax, 1%. You pay the tax, the story goes away, but the agenda and the broader narrative plows forward. Lather, rinse, repeat.